The Ford GT made for one hell of a racing car that competed in the GTE class at Le Mans. Now the cool thing about it is that it started as a race car project and then was developed into a road car, rather than the other way around that most manufacturers go for. That makes the road-going Ford GT a bit of an animal, and around a track it's going to absolutely obliterate any supercar or hypercar. So does that make the Ford GT a hypercar? Can sheer performance elevate it to a hypercar level above just simply a supercar? Or does it need to tick those hypercar boxes of massive power, crazy looks, and a stratospheric price tag? Now, we think there's another class of hypercar that the Ford GT would fit perfectly into, the Le Mans hypercar class. It's supposed to replace the LMP1 regulations at the end of 2020, and the FIA are trying to hark back to those epic cars of the GT1 era at the end of the 90s. The FIA wants these new hypercars to have a minimum of a 1,100 kilogram curb weight, 750 horsepower internal combustion engines, and they have the option of 250 horsepower hybrid systems, with the hybrid cars being slightly restricted so that the non-hybrid cars can compete. The target lap time is a 3:30 around Le Mans, which sits just under the current LMP2 cars. Flat out, the current Ford GTE car gets around Le Mans in around a 3:50, so taking 20 seconds off that lap time is really going some. Saying that, I've heard through the grapevine that Ford has pulled the GT from racing so that they can concentrate on a new hypercar to return to the top flight. Now, Ford stringently denies those rumours, but there's no smoke without fire. So how could they turn the GT into a hypercar? How could the performance of an already extreme racer be turned up to the next level? Well, let's start with hybridization. If you want to be the quickest on track these days, electric propulsion is a must, and the new hypercar class has that hybrid aspect. That allows a driver to press a button, engage electric motors on the front axle, which makes the car all-wheel drive, and you can ping out of a corner thanks to that new lump of power, and it produces acceleration like this. Now, the Ford engineers would need to find space for the batteries and the motors in the GT, but I'm sure it's nothing they can't handle. To meet the combined power limit of a hypercar of 1,100 horsepower, Ford would need to tune the V6 EcoBoost engine to around 750 horsepower. That's up from the 650 of the road car and the 500-ish horsepower of the racing car. Although surely a 100 horsepower gain isn't too much to ask of the Ford engineers, especially since they've got twin turbos to mess around with. Next up, more aero, and for this, I'm going to need my screwdriver. The aerodynamic package on the Ford GT racing car is already extreme and is mental for a road car. But it can go further, starting with a shark fin. A shark fin starts in the back of the cockpit and extends to the rear wing, with the thinking behind it being that it uses airflow to apply a force inwards towards the apex of a corner. That means the lateral forces on the car increase, which in turn increases the car's cornering speed and its stability. The current crop of LMP1 and LMP2 cars use this shark fin method to increase cornering speeds. At the rear, you could definitely increase the size of that rear wing to create more downforce, although the current rear wing is massive and is way bigger than the active wing you see on the road car. Also, underneath, you could definitely increase the severity of that diffuser, and all of these changes would bring a GTE car up towards the downforce levels of, say, an LMP2 car. Although at Le Mans, top speed is vital, so there has to be a balance between downforce and drag, and that's a balance that hypercars have to get spot on. And finally, mucking around with the dimensions of the bodywork and especially the wheelbase. Now, current LMP1 cars have quite strict regulations about overhangs due to the crashes that happened in the late 90s. Click up here to watch our video on exactly why those crashes happened. But with a GTE car, you could mess around with the bodywork and some of the dimensions in the car to create more downforce. For example, you could give it a much larger front and rear overhang, which means you can have more front and rear aero, and also you can mess about with the wheelbase of the car to create more space for Venturi tunnels underneath the car. Bigger tunnels means more suck down onto the tarmac, which means more downforce. So more internal combustion power, the addition of electrical propulsion, and more downforce. Those are the things that would take the Ford GTE up to the level of a hypercar. Bring all those things together and what would the car actually look like? Well, if you follow the supremely talented Sean Bull on Instagram, you may have seen his visualization of a Ford GT hypercar, and isn't it stunning? There's our favourite shark fin, a nice big rear wing, an even bigger diffuser, and we can imagine that underneath those propulsion changes have been made. And then think about homologating a car like this for the road, something that Ford will have to do to enter the hypercar class. Over 1,000 horsepower, all the downforce you could ever ask for, and that hybrid system to ping you out of every bend. Now, those of you that keep up with your car news may know that Ford not too long ago launched a car that's not dissimilar to this hypothetical car that we're talking about. At the Goodwood Festival of Speed, they launched the Ford GT Mark II, a track-only version of the GT that has turned everything up a notch. It has a larger wing than even the racing car, and along with a huge front splitter, a huge rear diffuser, and some front canards, it creates 4 times the downforce than the GT road car, and 400 pounds or 180 kilograms more downforce than the GTE racing car. They've also tuned the engine up to 700 horsepower. Anyone else's alarm bells ringing? Basically, create some space at the front for some electric motors and slap a shark fin on it, and you have the hypercar we've been talking about. Let's hope that Ford isn't bluffing with this car and they're just being cautious until the end of next year when the hypercar class kicks off. So if Ford were to enter a hypercar, who would they be up against? Well, the current contenders are Aston Martin with the Valkyrie, with its 1,000 horsepower 6.5 litre V12. Toyota have their GR Supersport, which apparently takes a lot of tech from their current LMP1 car, and then the somewhat unknown Scuderia Cameron Glickenhaus have also weighed in with their own hypercar. McLaren has said they will wait a year to scope things out, but expect the Senna GTR to be their weapon of choice. We all want to see Ford, Porsche, Ferrari, Jaguar, and even Mercedes joining up. But already our mouths are watering for the hypercar class heading into next year. But what about you guys? Who would you like to see in the hypercar class? Tell us in the comments below.